Good morning. It's Wednesday morning here at Redwood Christian Church, and I'm Pastor Matt. I'm coming at you live from my office. So I said we would, every Wednesday, we're going to do some Bible study, a devotional, if you will. And so here we go. Today we're going to kind of go backwards from last week, and we're going to go into chapter 2, and some of chapter 1 I'll probably start with. And as we talked last week about the idea of putting off the old self and putting to death, I know I talked about this concept of, we kind of rob from the grave. And the reason I say that we rob from the grave is because in Colossians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul says that our life has been hidden with God. And it also says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual morality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these two you once walked. Previously to that, he says in chapter 3, verse 2, I'll just go back to chapter 1. He says, if then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. So the reason I say that is we talk about this in our teachings on baptism, is really what you're doing is you're joining Christ in death and being raised new. So if you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God, and then you're to put certain behavior off or put it to death, that means it's died with your old self in the grave where Christ purchased your life. So in the fact that we would go back towards these things and grab those things is where I come up with the concept of grave robbing. And so it's talking about going back to behavior that should be dead in us, behavior that was paid for. Doesn't mean, again, what it doesn't mean is that you're going to do this perfectly. It doesn't mean you're not going to have moments of weakness or slip-ups or things like that. Otherwise, this whole concept is just really unattainable. The process of being sanctified or becoming more like Christ is a lifelong process that has ups and downs and ebbs and flows, and it's different than other people's. So Paul, moving into chapter 3, has first talked about some importance, and I want to pick up in chapter 1, verse 15, and then I'll go into chapter 2 a little bit, and I'll explain the philosophy that is built in a Christian's mindset really comes down to how we view, I guess, our place in everything, and how we really view Christ's place in our life. So in verse 15 of chapter 1, Paul continues to talk this after he encourages the people in Colossae, the Christians in Colossae, to walk, this verse 10, so to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, to be strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. So Paul, in doing that, is establishing kind of priority. He lists that, and some scribe sometime later puts in the subtext of that is, this is thanksgiving and prayer. So he says, even previously to that in verse 9, he says, and so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding. So Paul, to the church in Colossae, is encouraging them, strengthening them by trying to pour into them an understanding, knowledge or information that is useful in their day-to-day walk, and useful not only to theirs, talking historically, but it's useful to us. It's useful to us to understand that there's a preeminence that exists philosophically, the way that we think, the way that we behave, the way that we operate in this world becomes different in our new life, the life that is hidden with Christ in God. For you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. That's going to be kind of connective tissue for this. And so we look at these things and we start to understand that we walk according to a different way than the rest of the world around us. So philosophically, the way that we even think becomes different. The way that we operate, practice, all these things become different. And this is why. Verse 15, he says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn of the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you, who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation, under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister or servant." So to move through this, Paul is relating both that which was spoken previously in chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. Sorry, I got into some. Anyway, chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. Is the reality is Jesus has delivered us from the domain of darkness, that we too once walked in a manner that was like that. And that will come up again. It comes up again in chapter 3 when he says, "Therefore, if you have been raised with Christ, been saved," and moving in through this, he also is pointing to us as believers, that is what Christ has reconciled, believers to him. He is not, when he says all, he is not returning in the sense of that all are actually followers of him, but all who are followers of him have been reconciled. So Paul continues to point out that Jesus is the preeminent one. He is the first place one who is before all creation, and all things were created through him, not in any other way around that. Jesus is God. He is the great I am. And so he is God in flesh. So when we look at Jesus being God in flesh, it really is continuing to pull out this idea that your identity is no longer your own, but your identity is being transformed by the renewing of the mind. Paul would say in Romans, it's being remade after the image of its creator. Paul will say again in chapter 3, in the latter part of chapter 3. So I go back to, that is why that the efforts towards what we live in are what Christ has done for ourselves. So when you go into chapter 3, and you're moving from chapter 1 to chapter 3, we really move successfully through chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're moving through just in succession to what's being said, is Paul is really pulling out this idea that Jesus Christ must be the first thing in your life. So how do you even start your day? Could be a good challenge. It's a challenge I think that many of us probably struggle with as Christians. Like, is Christ first most when I'm looking at how I prioritize my day? And I'm not saying that you have to be, I think I mentioned this before, maybe in church, but maybe not. Maybe it was on last week's video. I can't remember. I'm not saying that you have to be in prayer in some regimented fashion, but prayer should be among the first things that we try to do in the day, to communicate with God through Jesus Christ, as the one who actually carries our prayers to God himself. And, excuse me. And so when we look at our day, I'm like, is that a priority? Are we even in priority to say that I want to do what God wants me to do? Do I begin with prayer? If this morning I overslept and went to the gymnasium, so went to the Y to go lift, and it was late. And on the way in did I take even a moment to kind of slow down, to stop, and to pray about what it is that God's going to do in this day? And today, I'll be honest, I didn't start there. But what happened at the Y was kind of cool, because when I got to the Y, I ended up in a conversation with a guy there, and only did 2 lifts this morning. I only did leg press and hack squat, and then I got caught into a probably 30, maybe even a 40-minute conversation with a guy who's just in town visiting, and visiting his friend. And so, but that's what God had planned for that day. Now I can have a choice in that moment or you can have a choice in that moment when you go when you actually go about your day of being inconvenienced by somebody or some situation, or you can look at it as an opportunity. And I think that oftentimes we even as Christians, we look at people as, or things or situations, as a nuisance rather than an opportunity. I think opportunities abound no matter where we are. I think the fields are plentiful for harvest. And in this case, the guy I was visiting with for that 30 to 40 minutes was a Christian, at least presenting him. He seemed genuine. From what I could tell, his faith and everything like that were genuine. And so I can have a conversation with the guy. I can talk with him. And that can be edifying in that moment. I can take time and pray for somebody, whether I'm actually physically putting my hand on them and praying for them, or I'm just praying for them in general. Those are moments that God gives us. And I think that when we approach things in the sense that Christ is preeminent, that he's first place, that he's the head of the church, that starting our day with Jesus is always better than starting our day without Jesus. And that's not mind-blowing. You know that. And it helps us, I think, to even frame in our day as if I go into chapter 2, which I'll actually do next week. We'll go into chapter 2, the rest of chapter 1 I'll finish today, but then we'll move into chapter 2, and how that really starts to pull out some things. So I would say as a challenge for today, because I'm trying to keep these within 15 minutes, a challenge for today is, where in my life is Christ not preeminent? I mean, because he's already preeminent, right? Regardless of what you think, Christ is preeminent. But we don't choose to treat Christ as preeminent. We sometimes will treat Christ as tertiary or secondary in order of succession or priority. That's not where Christ is. Christ is preeminent. He is first place. But in our free will, we're given the opportunity to choose day by day whether or not we're going to treat Christ as preeminent, whether or not we're going to run through the filter that Jesus is preeminent in my life. That means I'm going to start my day with prayer, with him, with the word of God, with other people, and I'm going to choose to do those things, or I'm going to choose to live for myself. I recently said in a discussion with somebody that, actually 2 days of discussion, really this topic came up, is the idea that I mean, we have a problem with idolatry, but it's not from these other places that everybody wants to point. The largest idol in my life is me. I'm the largest idol in my life. I'm the one who needs to be removed. And my prayer to God is, it might be aggressive and maybe some people don't like it, is that I want God to treat me like he treated the temple of Dagon in 1 Samuel. I want my life to be in such a way that God would, because of his presence in my life, that he would knock over the statue of Dagon, or statue of Matt Phipps, the statue of whoever else you are. that those things would be knocked over. And in that story, I'm going a little long here, but in that story in 1 Samuel, the Ark of the Covenant was put in the temple of Dagon, and that was to like somehow assume that Dagon had beat Yahweh. And the next day, the priests come into the temple of Dagon, and Dagon's knocked over off of his pedestal, and reportedly it was a large statue, and so they hoist him back up, they put him back up, and then on the next day they come back in, and not only did the statue fall over again, but also the head and the hands or the arms were removed from the statue as well, like they were cut off. I want Jesus to do that here. And that's what he does, is I'm dying. The idol of Matt Phipps needs to be the temple of Dagon. It needs to be the statue of Dagon, the idol of Dagon. It needs to not only be removed, but it needs to be severed, killed, destroyed, and that only Christ would reign in my life. So anyway, I went a minute longer than that, but my challenge to you this week in this week's devotional is ask God, where in my life am I on the throne where you are supposed to be on the throne? Maybe you pray along with me in this, that my idol, the idol of Matt Phipps, or the idol of your name, obviously, would be removed, like the statue of Dagon, the idol of Dagon was removed from the temple of Dagon, Philistia, the Philistines. Anyway, that's where I'm going to leave it today. I pray that you're doing well this week. I pray that God blesses you. I pray that you would put Christ preeminent in all areas of your life. And so read again Colossians chapter 1, read Colossians chapter 3. Next week I'll be out of town. Well, I'll be out of town on Wednesday, so I'm going to go ahead and either film chapter 2 today, or I'm actually going to film chapter 2 like Tuesday next week. But I'll probably film it here later today and then just repost it next Wednesday, so you guys can see chapter 2 as we continue to kind of pour through Colossians. So anyway, again, this is Pastor Matt. This is the Redwood Christian Church YouTube page. Please click like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, so that you can be updated with every post that we make, every video that we make. And we're still working on some of our other stuff. We're still working on some of our YouTube issues. So anyway, just we'll keep you updated. Keep checking in. All right. God bless. Talk to you later. Bye.